The village of Ashfin had not seen rain in 40 days. The creek that ran behind the mill had thinned to a whisper, threading between stones that were never supposed to be visible, their pale bellies exposed to the sky like something embarrassed. The elder oaks along the north road had begun dropping their leaves early, not the slow, dignified surrender of autumn, but a dry, defeated shedding, as though the trees had simply run out of patience with summer and decided to begin grieving ahead of schedule. The farmers talked about it at the well each morning in the particular tone that farmers reserved for disasters they had predicted and were now experiencing no satisfaction from being right about. The soil had cracked in long, wandering lines across the fields, like the land itself was trying to read its own palm and didn't like what it found. And Corvin Dast had not seen trouble in 40 years. He liked it that way. He liked it the way other men liked good wine or warm fires or the sound of their own children laughing, with a bone-deep proprietary satisfaction, the satisfaction of something cultivated and maintained and quietly celebrated. His peace was not an accident. It was a project. It had required over the decades the careful management of relationships, expectations, and geography. He had moved to Ashfin precisely because it was the sort of village that did not produce interesting news. He had chosen his cottage at the forest edge precisely because it was a 20-minute walk from the nearest neighbor, which was, in his experience, exactly 20 minutes more walking than most problems were willing to do. The cottage sat where the tilled fields gave up and the tree line began, as though the forest and the farmland had agreed on a boundary years ago and both sides had honored it with equal respect. It was a low-roofed, thick-walled, deep-windowed sort of building, the kind that had been built by someone who understood winters and did not intend to be caught unprepared by them. Wisteria had colonized the eastern wall so thoroughly over the years that it was unclear in summer where the stone ended and the plant began. The garden was small and practical. Turnips, some defiant rosemary, 3 apple trees that produced fruit every other year with the stubbornness of animals that knew their own schedule. A woodpile ran the length of the south wall, perfectly stacked, the logs split to identical widths. A rain barrel sat beneath the guttered eave, frustratingly empty in the current drought. And beside it, the old wooden wheelbarrow that Corvin used for the garden and had used for 12 years, and would have used for 12 more if everything had continued as it was supposed to continue. Everything did not continue as it was supposed to continue. Inside, the cottage was the kind of organized that happened when a very particular kind of mind had been applied to a space over a very long period of time. The shelves were deep and carefully labeled. The maps, and there were many maps, rolled and flat-stored and framed and pinned, occupied 3 full walls of the study and a portion of the hallway and what had originally been intended as a second bedroom. Corvin's cartography tools were laid out on their dedicated table with the reverence of surgical instruments. The compass, the ruling pens, the set of brass dividers worn smooth at the grip from decades of use, the magnifying glass on its jointed arm, the little bone folder he used to crease parchment without tearing it. He had retired from active surveying 11 years ago, when his left knee had begun offering strong opinions about uneven terrain. But he still worked, copying, correcting, restoring old maps that came to him by post from collectors and archives who had heard of his precision. He still worked, he still had his routine, he still had his quiet. The routine was, by any objective measure, a thing of beauty in its simplicity. He woke before the light and lay still for a few minutes listening to whatever the forest was doing, birds in summer, wind in autumn, deep silence in winter. Then he dressed, put water on for tea, fed soot, opened the study window exactly 6 inches to let the morning air move through the parchment without warping it, and sat down at his work table. He worked for 3 hours. He ate a breakfast that was, with minor seasonal variation, the same breakfast he had eaten every morning for 11 years. Eggs when he had them, bread always, something from the garden if it was offering. He walked the perimeter of the property, checked the woodpile, checked the garden. He worked again in the afternoon. He took an evening walk into the tree line, not far, just far enough to hear the deeper quiet that lived under the canopy. He ate, he read, he slept. His neighbors set their clocks by the sound of his morning kettle. This was not a metaphor. Old Gretchen, whose cottage was the nearest to his along the forest road, had actually told him this once, with a warmth that had made him feel both pleased and faintly cornered. He had smiled and said something noncommittal and walked home and felt, for the rest of that day, the particular satisfaction of a man whose life has achieved the precision of a good instrument. Soot was the only other living creature who shared this life, and Soot was frankly the ideal companion for it. He was a large gray cat of indeterminate age and absolutely determinate opinions. He approved of silence. He approved of warmth. He approved of Corvin's work table, specifically the left corner of it, which caught the afternoon sun through the west window at precisely the right angle for a cat of discernment to sleep in. He did not approve of visitors, loud noises, changes to his feeding schedule, or the particular type of birdsong produced by the blue jays that nested in the apple trees, which he regarded as a personal provocation. He communicated these preferences with a vocabulary of expressions that Corvin had long since learned to read as fluently as any map. The slow blink of approval, the sharp single flick of the tail that meant do not test me, the particular set of the ears that meant something has displeased me, and I am composing a formal complaint. Theirs was a deeply functional relationship. Corvin did not require affection. Soot did not require conversation. They had arrived years ago at a mutual understanding that suited them both completely. That was the life. That was the Tuesday morning, the 41st morning of the drought, when Corvin pulled on his worn leather boots, picked up the handles of the wheelbarrow to move it to the east side of the garden where the turnips were suffering most, and found the dragon. He almost didn't see it. That was the first thing, the sheer improbability of the moment, the way the ordinary texture of the morning had been interrupted by something that had no business being there, tucked into the space between the wheelbarrow's left wheel and the damp stones of the cottage wall like it had always been there, like Corvin simply hadn't looked closely enough before. It was curled. That was the first thing his eyes registered, a curl, a shape that was at once deeply animal and deeply geometric, tail wrapped over nose, wings pressed flat to its sides, the whole form no larger than Soot at his widest, which was fairly wide. It occupied a space roughly the size of a rolled cartography case. In the dim, angled light of early morning, the scales did not look real. They looked like something a jeweler might do to a very small sculpture if the jeweler were having an unusually ambitious day. Each individual scale barely larger than a thumbnail, layered and overlapping with the kind of precision that Corvin, whose entire professional life had been devoted to precision, recognized with a jolt of something close to reverence. The color was impossible. Not impossible in the sense of visually incoherent, impossible in the sense of refusing to stay the same. Looking directly at it, the dragon was green, dark green, deep green, the green of water in a forest pool where the trees grew close overhead and the light came down filtered and slow. But as Corvin shifted his weight, as the angle of the morning light moved by the fraction of a degree that his movement created, the green became gold. Then the gold became copper. Then the copper ran back toward green through a spectrum that didn't have names yet, colors that lived in the space between colors, iridescent in a way that made Corvin think of beetles, of opals, of the way certain fish turned in water. The scales were alive with it. Every tiny plate of the creature's armor was doing its own small, individual version of this trick, which meant that the whole animal seemed to be in constant, almost imperceptible motion even while it was completely still. Corvin stood there holding the handles of his wheelbarrow and did not move for what was probably 30 seconds, and felt like considerably longer. The wings were what finally made him accept that this was real, and not some waking extension of the dreams he couldn't remember. They were folded completely, carefully folded along the dragon's ribs like the wings of a sleeping bird. But even in their folded state their structure was visible, the bones of them pressing against the membranous skin in a delicate tracery of lines that Corvin's cartographer's eye involuntarily mapped. The primary strut running from shoulder to wingtip, the secondary branching struts, the thinner ribs between them fanning like the illustration in a book on bat anatomy. The membrane was translucent at its thinnest points. The morning light came through it and split into the faintest possible spectrum. They were too small, he could see that even folded. This was a young creature. Whatever it would become, whatever scale it would eventually occupy in the world, it had not gotten there yet. The wings were still faintly crumpled at their trailing edges, like paper that had been folded too long in the wrong direction and hadn't entirely recovered. There was something about that crumpling, that specific imperfection in all this impossible beauty, that hit Corvin somewhere he hadn't expected to be hit, and made his chest do something complicated. He stood there, wheelbarrow handles in his hands, the morning birds doing their business in the apple trees, the distant sound of the creek that wasn't really a creek anymore, and then the dragon opened its eyes. They were copper, not the green gold copper of the scales, pure copper, the color of an old coin held to the sun, warm and ancient and lit from inside, and they were undeniably looking at him. Looking at him in the specific way that meant looking at, not simply registering the presence of a large object. The eyes had depth. The eyes had attention. The eyes contained something that Corvin could not immediately categorize, which was in itself remarkable, because Corvin was a man who categorized things immediately and with confidence. The moment held. Then the dragon sneezed. It was a small sneeze. It was objectively an almost comically small sneeze for a creature of mythological significance. A tiny, explosive little of sound, the kind of sneeze a kitten might produce if the kitten had been deeply embarrassed by a piece of dust. Corvin would have found it endearing, would have found the whole thing endearing, except for the very specific and immediate problem that the sneeze produced a small, perfect, geometrically precise cone of flame that shot from both nostrils simultaneously, traveled approximately 14 inches through the early morning air, and connected with the toe of his left boot with a sound like a whispered F-wump. He looked down. The boot was smoking, gently, in a contained, sheepish way as though the boot itself was embarrassed on behalf of the flame. The leather had not ignited, too thick, too old, too worn in, but a dark patch of scorched leather now decorated the toe where no scorched patch had been before, and the wool of his sock inside was meaningfully warmer than it had been a moment ago. He looked back at the dragons. The dragon was looking at him with the copper eyes, and its expression, if one could attribute expression to something that had no eyebrows and a face built for a different kind of communication than the human face was built for, was the expression of something that had not entirely intended that particular outcome and was aware that it needed to address the situation. It made a sound. The sound was, Corvin would spend a great deal of time over the following days trying to accurately describe this sound to himself, in the private way that a man accustomed to precision tries to apply precision to things that resist it. It was somewhere between a chirp and a rumble. The chirp component had the quality of something small and sharp and bright, like the beginning of a bird's call, but the rumble underneath it was warm and resonant in a way that was entirely at odds with the creature's size. A sound that implied a much larger body, a chest cavity built for it, a depth that shouldn't have been physically possible. Together, the two elements produced something that occupied an acoustic space Corvin had genuinely never encountered before, and which communicated. He was absolutely certain of this, with the certainty of a man who had no rational basis for certainty. I didn't mean to do that, and I recognize that this is not an ideal beginning. He stared at it for another few seconds. He had mapped the Thornback Mountains. He had navigated the Mirewing swamps in November in rain, using a compass that had been slightly magnetized by a lightning strike and a set of charts drawn by a cartographer who had charitably been working from optimistic assumptions about what the word passable meant. He had once spent 4 days sheltering in a cave in the Sundrift Highlands, while a storm that the locals later described as historic tried to remove the mountain he was on. He had done all of these things with the measured calm of a man who understood that panic was simply a waste of resources that could be directed more productively elsewhere. He was not, he told himself firmly, going to be unmanned by a lizard the size of a cat. He set down the wheelbarrow handles. He crouched to his knees, which objected in the way his knees now habitually objected to such requests, and he studied the dragon at eye level. The copper eyes tracked him through this movement without blinking. The dragon did not flinch, did not pull back, did not attempt any defensive posture. It simply watched him with the patience of a creature that had decided on some level that whatever came next was acceptable. The beauty of it at this distance was almost aggressive. Every individual scale was perfect. The transition zones where the color-shifting quality was strongest, the ridge of the spine, the curve of the jaw, the leading edge of each folded wing, caught the growing morning light and did things with it that Corvin found genuinely difficult to look away from. There was a faint luminescence to the chest and throat, a barely there inner warmth that might have been the aftermath of the sneeze or might simply have been the natural condition of the animal. The claws, 4 on each forefoot, slightly curved, dark at their tips, were hooked loosely over the stone that served as the wheelbarrow's resting surface. They were, even in repose, evidently very sharp. Well, Corvin said, because a man had to say something. The dragon made the chirprumble sound again, softer this time. Then it tilted its head, and the gesture was so perfectly, disarmingly familiar, so precisely the gesture of a dog or a cat encountering something puzzling, that something in Corvin's considerable defenses developed a crack. He reached out his hand. He did this slowly, with his palm turned upward, the way one approached an animal one wasn't certain about. His hand hovered 6 inches from the dragon's snout. The dragon looked at his hand. It looked at him. It looked at his hand again. Then, with a deliberateness that was somehow more unsettling than if it had simply acted instinctively, it leaned forward and pressed its snout against the center of his palm. The warmth was extraordinary. Not painful, not even approaching painful, but profound, like pressing your hand against a stone that had been in sunlight all afternoon, that specific heat that had depth to it that came from within rather than from the surface. The scales against his palm were smooth in a way he hadn't expected, not rough like lizard skin but almost frictionless like polished stone or water-worn glass. He could feel the musculature shifting beneath them as the dragon adjusted its position, the small, complex movements of a creature settling into contact with something new. Then it gripped his forearm. The talons came around from underneath with a precision that left no room for doubt about their owner's manual dexterity, each one finding its position on his forearm with a care that was not the carefulness of reluctance but the carefulness of intention. I know exactly where I am placing each of these, and they did not pierce the fabric of his sleeve, did not scratch the skin beneath it, did not so much as compress the material beyond what was needed for a secure hold. It was the grip of something that understood how to use its own strength. It was approximately 8 pounds of dragon holding onto his forearm with absolute confidence. as though the forearm had always been there for this purpose, and now they had both finally arrived at the moment the universe had been building toward. Corvin sat back on his heels, arm out, dragon attached. The dragon pressed its warm jaw against his wrist and began to purr. The purr was an engineering achievement. It operated at a frequency that Corvin could feel in his teeth and in the back of his sternum simultaneously. It was not loud, it was pervasive. It filled the small space between them the way water fills a cup, completely and without gaps. And it had the quality, Corvin would think about this later in the study, while trying to draw accurate lines and finding his hand unusually steady, of something that had been looking for the right vessel and had decided, tentatively and with apparent satisfaction, that this one would do. Behind him, from the windowsill, there came a sound. He turned to look. Soot was sitting in the kitchen window, the one Corvin always left cracked in the morning, with the specific stillness of a cat who has just had a significant piece of information delivered to him and is processing its implications. His yellow eyes were fixed on the dragon with an expression that Corvin recognized immediately, because he had seen it before, directed at the blue jays. It was the expression that said, "This is a formal declaration, we are not done." Corvin looked at Soot, he looked at the dragon on his arm, he looked at his scorched boot. He looked at the morning sky above the apple trees, which was doing nothing helpful, simply existing in its drought-pale blue way without offering any guidance. He stood up, dragon and all, and carried it inside. He set it on the kitchen table, which it immediately walked the length of, investigating the grain of the wood with a focused attention that managed to be simultaneously very dragon-like and very cat-like, touching its nose to the surface at intervals like a scholar checking citations. Corvin stood back and crossed his arms and applied the same logical approach he applied to all problems. The logical approach produced the following inventory of facts. 1. The dragon was real. 2. The dragon was by all evidence young. Young, probably healthy, it moved without the hesitancy of injury, its eyes were clear, its scales unbroken except for a small cluster near the base of the tail where new growth appeared to be coming in, slightly lighter in color, the scales not yet fully hardened to their final shade. Young and, he thought, possibly recently separated from wherever it had come from. How recently he had no way of knowing. 3. It had come to his property specifically and hidden itself in a spot that, based on the faint impression in the soil when he'd lifted the wheelbarrow, it had occupied for at least several hours, possibly overnight. 4. It had, upon being discovered, produced fire, accidental fire. Apparently, the involuntary fire of an animal that sneezed, not the deliberate fire of an animal under threat, and had then communicated, with a clarity that defied his ability to explain it, something that could only be described as regret. 5. It was now eating his spare candle. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides. The dragon looked up from the candle with the expression of an individual who had been operating under the assumption that this was a permitted activity and was only now receiving conflicting information. A small length of candle disappeared between its teeth with a crunch that was somehow both delicate and final. "No," Corvin said. The dragon considered this, then it ate the rest of the candle. Corvin stood there. The dragon licked a drop of wax from its lower lip with a tongue that was very slightly forked and very slightly luminescent, in the same way its chest was luminescent, as though fire were simply a condition it carried around with it at all times in a carefully managed low-level way. The copper eyes looked at him with what could only be described, despite the logical impossibility of this description, as patience. Soot had come in from the window and was stationed at the far end of the kitchen counter, monitoring proceedings with the air of a general who had already decided on his strategy and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment. One night, Corvin said, he was a reasonable man. He was also, and he recognized this about himself, a man who had been alone for a long time and who had, he would not dwell on this, it was simply a fact, sometimes sat in his study in the deep quiet of winter evenings and felt the quality of that quiet differently than he felt it in other seasons. Not badly, not in a way that required remediation. Simply differently, more audibly, as a presence rather than an absence. He said one night. The dragon blinked at him slowly with the copper eyes. Then it reached out one small talon and touched the inkwell on the kitchen shelf, the spare inkwell, the one he used for the less precious restoration work, filled with a dark iron-gall black ink, and sniffed it. Then, with the focused intentionality of someone executing a decision they had already made, it picked up the inkwell in both forefeet, bit the stopper out, tilted it, and drank approximately half the ink in one sustained swallow. Corvin opened his mouth. The dragon set the inkwell down. It sat very still for a moment with the expression of a creature experiencing something new and interesting happening in its internal environment. Then it opened its mouth, and what came out was not fire. It was smoke, but not ordinary smoke, not the gray, chaotic, dissipating smoke of burning. It was ink-dark smoke that moved with a strange coherence that curled and rose in a column toward the ceiling and then, rather than dispersing, began to arrange itself. He watched it happen with the specific quality of attention a man applies to something that should not be possible and is happening anyway. The smoke curved. The smoke thickened in some areas, thinned in others. It moved like a hand writing, if the hand were invisible and working on a medium made of air. And then, drifting up there in the space beneath his kitchen ceiling, unmistakably, slowly dissipating at the edges but absolutely clear in the center. Hello. Not suggested, not resembling. Hello in lettering that matched, almost perfectly, the copperplate hand that Corvin used for his cartographic annotations, the lettering he had spent 15 years perfecting to the point where it was as instinctive as his own signature. The smoke word hung in the air for approximately 4 seconds. Then it dissolved into nothing, and the kitchen smelled very faintly of ink and something warmer underneath. Corvin sat down in his kitchen chair. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the space where the word had been. The dragon watched him from the table, perfectly still, perfectly patient, glowing its faint amber glow in the morning kitchen light. After a while, Soot, against what must have been his better judgment, against the entire established doctrine of his self-respect, stepped off the counter and walked stiffly across the floor and sat down beside the table leg, very close to where the dragon was sitting. He did not look at the dragon. He looked straight ahead, toward the door with immense dignity, as though his proximity to the dragon's table leg was a matter of complete coincidence and spatial necessity, and bore absolutely no relation to the dragon's existence as an entity. Corvin looked at Soot. Soot did not look back. Corvin looked at the dragons. The dragon looked at him with the copper eyes, and the copper eyes were warm, and the cottage that smelled of old parchment and pine resin was slightly warmer than it had been before, in a way that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with the 8 pounds of luminescent, ink-drinking, history-rearranging, boot-singeing chaos currently sitting on his kitchen table as though it had been there its whole life. One night, Corvin said for the second time. He said it quietly, and he said it without conviction, and he said it in the tone of a man who already knows that what he is saying is not quite true, has perhaps not been quite true since the moment he picked up the creature from under the wheelbarrow and felt the warmth of it against his palm, but who needs to say it anyway because some bridges are easier to cross if you approach them slowly and at an angle. The dragon blinked at him. Outside, the drought-pale sky was fully brightening now, and the elder oaks along the north road were dropping their early leaves, and the creek that wasn't a creek was whispering between its exposed stones, and everything was, on the surface, exactly as it had been before. Except that Corvin Dast, who had not seen trouble in 40 years, who had built his whole life around the careful cultivation of stillness, who had chosen this village and this cottage and this precise, measured, perfected routine precisely because he had once long ago lived the other kind of life, the kind with urgency and discovery and the constant, electric uncertainty of not knowing what came next, was sitting in his kitchen chair looking at a beautiful small dragon with copper eyes and feeling. Beneath all the logical caution, beneath all the sensible cataloging of facts, something that he had not felt in a very long time. He was interested. Deeply, inconveniently, irrevocably interested. The day had barely begun. The maps were the first thing. Corvin discovered them at the particular hour of early morning when the light had not yet committed to being daylight, that gray, provisional time when the world looked like a preliminary sketch of itself, everything present but nothing fully rendered. He had woken at his usual hour, dressed in his usual order, left foot boot first then right, the same sequence he had followed for so long that deviating from it felt vaguely transgressive. He had expected to come downstairs and find the dragon in whatever arrangement he had left it in the night before, curled on the folded blanket he had reluctantly placed in the corner of the kitchen, which had felt uncomfortably like a gesture of permanence for something that was only staying one night. He had not expected to find the study door open. He was certain, professionally certain, with the certainty of a man whose entire career had been built on the exact observation and recording of things, that he had closed that door. He always closed that door. The study was where the maps lived, and maps lived best in a controlled environment, consistent temperature, no drafts, no direct morning light until he was present to manage the window. He had closed that door. He had heard the latch engage. He stood in the hallway and looked through the open door and did not for a moment move. The maps were on the walls. All of them. Every map he owned, the rolled ones from the flat storage drawers, the loose sheets from the pressed paper folders, the framed pieces he had not touched in years, the careful restorations still waiting for their final varnish coat, the rough field sketches he kept not because they were good but because they were true, drawn on whatever paper had been available in whatever conditions had been presenting themselves. Every single one of them was on the walls. And they had been arranged. Not randomly, not in any order that Corvin would have chosen himself, not even in the geographic or chronological systems he had experimented with over the years and abandoned. The arrangement followed a logic he did not immediately grasp, which was itself disorienting because Corvin grasped arrangements quickly. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, eyes moving across the walls, his cartographer's mind doing what it always did, looking for the organizing principle, the underlying system, the reason behind the pattern, and coming up empty. The dragon was sitting in the center of the room on top of the work table, looking at him with the copper eyes, waiting with every evidence of patience for him to see it. Then Corvin's eyes adjusted. Then he stepped back, quite literally, to get a different angle, and the organization of the room changed perspective around him the way a landscape changes when you climb a slight rise, and suddenly the features you've been walking through resolve into a shape you couldn't see from inside it. Chronological. Not by the date the maps had been made, by the date of the territory. Oldest civilization, oldest boundaries, oldest roads at the bottom of the spiral closest to the floor. Most recent survey, most current political lines, most newly drawn coastlines at the top near the ceiling. And it was a spiral, that was the structure. A clockwise spiral that started near the baseboard behind the desk and wound upward and outward around all four walls, so that standing in the center of the room, rotating slowly, you moved through history. You stood inside a timeline. Each map was fixed to the wall, not with the pushpins Corvin kept in his supply drawer, but with scales. Shed dragon scales, each one barely larger than his thumbnail, pressed into the old plaster at the corners with a precision that suggested both significant force and extraordinary care. Not a single document was torn. Not a single corner was bent. The scales had gone in at exactly the right depth and angle to hold without damaging, and they caught the weak morning light from the study window and threw tiny colored sparks across everything. He walked the spiral. It took nearly 10 minutes. He went slowly, not because he was uncertain of his steps, but because the arrangement compelled slowness, because whoever or whatever had built this had built it to be experienced at walking pace, had laid it out so that each map led to the next in a way that told a story, the specific story of how the world had been understood by the people who had tried to draw it. He saw his own work woven in, his surveys of the Thornback Range, his coastal charts of the Velmere Straits, his careful city plans of 3 different capital cities in 3 different decades, and he saw them placed not by when he had made them but by where they fit in the larger arc, in conversation with maps made by cartographers long dead, in dialogue with the best and most accurate and most earnestly wrong charts that the long history of attempting to know the world had produced. It was, as an act of curation, extraordinary. It was, as something a creature the size of a barn cat had accomplished overnight in complete darkness, using its own body parts as fasteners. Absolutely staggering. He turned to look at the dragon, still sitting on the work table, and the dragon looked back at him, and there was in the copper eyes. Corvin was beginning to accept that he was going to keep seeing things in those eyes that he had no rational architecture to support, a quality that he could only call attentiveness. Not pride, not the look of an animal seeking approval for a performed trick. Something quieter and more focused than either of those. The look of an entity that had done something because the thing needed doing, and was now watching to see if the person it had been done for was going to understand what they were looking at. Corvin understood what he was looking at. He sat down in his chair, which was at the center of the spiral, and he sat there for a long time without saying anything. The morning light moved slowly across the walls. The maps, all his maps, all the work of his life and the work of the people who had come before him, breathed quietly in the arrangement that should not have been possible. Right, he said finally. His voice came out differently than he expected. Slightly rougher, slightly lower, the voice of a man who has just had something demonstrated to him that he wasn't prepared to have demonstrated. The dragon made the chirprumble sound and began, with delicate and focused attention, resealing a small lifted corner of an 18th century coastal chart with a precise touch of controlled flame, less than a candle's worth, directed with a surgeon's economy that re-adhered the old paste without scorching so much as a fiber. Corvin watched this happen. Right, he said again in a different tone, the tone of a man revising his assessment. Word traveled with the particular velocity that small villages achieve when the information in question is sufficiently extraordinary. By mid-morning of the second day, the queue had formed. Corvin discovered it when he went to check the state of his rain barrel, still empty, the drought showing no mercy, and found 7 people standing at his gate in a loose formation that suggested they had arrived independently, and then clumped together in the way that individually purposeful people did when they found others with the same purpose and needed to negotiate precedence. They were all looking at the cottage with the focused expression of people who had come to conduct business. Old Marin was first, which surprised Corvin not at all. She was the village herbalist, though herbalist was a word that covered a wide range of practices in Marin's case, some of them botanical and some of them significantly more ambiguous. And she was approximately 80 years old and had the personal gravity of someone twice that age. The kind of woman who moved slowly not because she was frail, but because she had decided that hurrying was for people who hadn't learned to plan ahead. She had her basket on her arm, which meant she had come in a professional capacity, and she looked at Corvin over the gate with eyes that were bright and sharp and missing nothing. "The fire," she said without preamble, "is it controllable?" "Not entirely," Corvin said honestly. "But more than a fireplace." "More precise than a fireplace," he said, and then regretted the precision of his own word choice when he saw the quality of attention this produced in Marin's expression. Behind her, the blacksmith's apprentice, young Edward, 19 and broadly built, with the permanent soot marks of his trade worked into the creases of his hands, held up a sword. Not a whole sword. The front 8 inches of a sword snapped cleanly at the break with what had been a very fine blade before whatever force had parted it. He held it up with the particular expression of a person who has not yet articulated their request, but believes that making the object visible is a sufficient opening statement. Corvin looked at the broken sword. The broken sword looked back at him. "No," Corvin said. "I haven't asked yet," Edward said. "No," Corvin said again and turned to address the rest of the queue, which had grown during this exchange to include Brenna from the pottery, 2 of the Caldwell farmers, a young woman Corvin didn't recognize but whose manner suggested she had walked some distance this morning, and the 3 children from the miller's family, Cass and her 2 younger brothers, who were not in the queue so much as they were pressed against the fence itself in a kind of plasmic arrangement, each face occupying as much of the space between fence rails as physics would permit. The miller's children were not interested in cauterization or metallurgy. They were interested in the dragon, which had appeared on top of the gate post sometime in the last 30 seconds, apparently without Corvin noticing it leave the cottage, perched on the old iron finial with its wings half spread, balanced with an ease that seemed to require no effort, like a hawk selecting a hunting post or a cat selecting whatever the cat has decided is optimal. Half spread was the key development. 2 days ago, the wings had been crumpled and too small and moving carefully, gliding more than flying, the hesitant experimentation of a young creature testing the gap between its current capabilities and its potential ones. This morning they were wider, and they held the air differently, less tentatively, with more of the ownership that wings are supposed to have over air. And the morning sun coming over the cottage roof hit their translucent membranes and split into light the way glass splits light. A dozen small spectra scattered across the fence and the faces of the children below. Cass said, "Oh." Just that, just "oh," the single syllable of a child who has had a genuine encounter with something beautiful, and found that the usual words weren't built for the job, and that even this small sound was perhaps too many syllables. The dragon looked down at them. Then it preened an actual full bird-style preening motion, running the edge of a wing across its jaw and down to the wingtip. And the action was so precisely theatrical, so exactly the behavior of a performer who knows they have an audience and has decided to justify the attention, that Corvin, despite every intention to the contrary, felt the corner of his mouth move. "No," he told the queue. "Whatever you came for, no, I'm sorry for the inconvenience of your walk. Good morning." He collected the dragon from the gatepost. It stepped onto his forearm with the same assured grip as before, talons placing themselves with the care of long practice, and went back inside and spent the next hour turning people away from the door, which they had apparently decided was a more promising avenue once the gate approach had failed. This became the pattern of the days. The queue, the returning, the word spreading further, finding new permutations as it traveled. It breathes fire and shapes, it sorts documents, it knows things it shouldn't know. It cured Marin's burn patient. This last one Corvin suspected had originated with Marin herself, who had obtained a brief unauthorized consultation through the kitchen window on the 3rd morning before Corvin had come downstairs. He turned everyone away. He did this with the firmness of a man who understood that beginning exceptions was the same as abandoning the principle, which he had learned very thoroughly in the years before he had come to Ashvin and built the life he had been building here. Meanwhile, inside the cottage, the dragon continued its investigations. The investigations were, Corvin spent considerable mental energy trying to find the right word for them. Thorough was accurate but insufficient. Systematic was accurate but implied a system that Corvin could identify from the outside, which he frequently couldn't. What Pip he was using the name now in his own head, out loud occasionally by accident, once directly while the dragon was looking at him, which had produced a particular quality of attention in the copper eyes that Corvin had decided not to examine too closely. What Pip did to a space or an object was not the investigation of someone with a plan so much as the investigation of someone with an appetite. He wanted to understand things, everything. He wanted to understand them at a level of detail that most entities would consider excessive, and then continue past that level into territory that most entities didn't know existed. The spices were perhaps the least consequential example, but they were the one Corvin found most illuminating. He had come into the kitchen on the third afternoon to find his spice cabinet open. Pip had at some point learned the action of a latch, which Corvin would later realize should have been treated as a more significant development, and every jar, tin, and paper twist of spice laid out along the windowsill in a row. He had expected chaos. He had found order, each container positioned with its opening toward the center of the room, arranged in a line that, when Corvin bent to examine it, proceeded from left to right in order of scent intensity. The mild background spices, the dried thyme, the bay leaves, the old mild pepper were at the far left. The middle of the row held the medium notes, the cumin and coriander and warm ginger. The far right held the aggressive ones, the hot pepper and the ground cloves, and a small jar of dried yellow root that had come from somewhere, and whose identity Corvin had never quite established. Pip was sitting at the far right end of the row, touching his nose to the hot pepper jar with the expression of a naturalist who has encountered a particularly interesting specimen, and is taking comprehensive notes. "That's hot," Corvin said. Pip looked at him, then he touched the jar again. Then he sneezed, this time into the far corner of the room in a direction he had apparently learned to aim himself since the boot incident, the flame going precisely nowhere damaging, and looked up with watering copper eyes and an expression of someone who has obtained important data at a reasonable personal cost. "I tried to tell you," Corvin said. The boots were next, in the sense that the boots were the incident that most directly impacted Corvin's morning routine. He came downstairs on the fourth morning to find both pairs of his working boots, the heavy field boots he hadn't worn in years and the daily ones with the scorched toe, nested inside each other, sole to sole, toes pointing inward, the smaller inside the larger, with the geometric satisfaction of a set of Russian dolls. The arrangement was undeniably pleasing from an organizational standpoint and completely unusable from a wearing them standpoint, since extracting one boot from inside the other without damaging either was an operation requiring both hands and a degree of patience that Corvin could only muster before his first cup of tea with difficulty. He stood in the kitchen in his socks, holding both boots, looking at Pip. Pip looked back at him with an expression that suggested that from where the dragon stood, the arrangement had been an improvement. "Geometry," Corvin said, "is not the only criterion." The kettle went on the fourth morning. He didn't see it happen. He was in the study, working on a restoration, carefully breathing moisture onto the brittle edge of a 15th century river survey, the kind of delicate rehydration work that required total attention and a steady hand, and he heard nothing concerning from the kitchen, which in retrospect he should have registered as suspicious because the mornings had over the preceding days established that no sound from the kitchen was actually more alarming than various sounds from the kitchen. Since Pip's most ambitious investigations tended to happen quietly. He went to put the water on for his second cup of tea and found the kitchen empty of kettles. He checked the obvious places. He checked under the table, inside the bread box in the pantry, behind the dry goods shelf where Pip had once relocated a collection of wooden spoons for reasons that remained unclear. No kettle. Then he looked up. Corvin stood in the center of his kitchen, head back, and looked through the kitchen window at the roof of his own cottage. And on the roof of his own cottage, sitting on the ridge tiles with the particular settled quality of an object that had been placed there intentionally, was his kettle. He stood there for a moment. Why, he said, to the cottage in general and Pip in particular, wherever Pip currently was. A small sound from above. Corvin went outside, around to where the garden ladder was leaned against the wall under the eave, and climbed with the careful deliberateness of a man who was going to have words with his joints about this later. He pulled himself up onto the low-pitched roof, old sound tiles, warm from the morning sun already, and there was Pip, perched on the ridge beside the kettle, wings half spread for balance, looking out over the garden and the tree line beyond with an expression of such absorbed attention that Corvin stopped his advance and simply looked at what the dragon was looking at. From the roof, the cottage's position became clear in a way it wasn't from the ground. The garden and its struggling turnips, the path to the gate, the road beyond the gate running north toward the village, the rooftops just visible where the road dipped then rose. And beyond the road, beyond the village, the tree line, the beginning of the actual forest, not the managed edge of it but the deeper forest. The one that didn't have paths that went east and north and eventually became the Thornback foothills, rising in the far distance like a rumor. Pip was looking at the forest. He had been looking at the forest. The kettle was incidental, it was simply there, it was warm when it had water in it, the steam was interesting, and the roof was where the interesting view was, so the kettle had come with him because the kettle belonged to the interesting things category, and when you were going to the interesting place, you brought the interesting things. This was, Corvin realized, standing on his own roof with the sun coming up over the apple trees and the drought-pale countryside laid out around him, a completely coherent logic. It was just not a logic he had been using. He sat down on the ridge tiles beside the dragon and the kettle, and the three of them looked at the forest together. And for a while there was no chaos at all, just the particular quality of morning that only existed at height, and the distant sound of the creek that wasn't a creek, and the warm amber glow of the creature beside him pulsing quietly with its internal fire like a coal that didn't need tending. On the fifth day, the ink incident happened, or more precisely, the second ink incident, the first having been the initial drinking episode, which Corvin had now retrospectively reclassified as exploratory in light of what the fifth day produced. Pip had found the reserve ink supply. Corvin kept his inks in the study cabinet, 12 small glass bottles of various formulations, the iron gall blacks he used for most cartographic work, 2 warm browns for older-style restoration, a bottle of blue-black for coastline annotation, and 1 small, precious bottle of a deep red ink he used only for marking the proprietary elements of his own survey work. He had kept these inks for years, purchasing them from a specialty supplier in the capital who sourced the pigments from places Corvin had never asked about because the results spoke sufficiently for themselves. When he came into the study on the 5th morning, all 12 bottles were open on his work table, arranged in a specific pattern he didn't immediately recognize, and Pip was sitting behind them with an expression of focused deliberateness and a faint but unmistakable blue tinge to the underside of his chin that had not been there yesterday. He had been drinking the inks, not all of them, not indiscriminately. He had been sampling them, Corvin understood as he looked more closely, touching his tongue to each and reacting differently to each. The warm browns producing a low rumble of apparent satisfaction, the blue-black producing a specific tilt of the head and a brief experimental emission of dark blue smoke, the red producing something that was almost a sneeze but wasn't quite, a controlled exhalation that smelled powerfully of iron and old books. The pattern of the bottles. Corvin stopped looking at Pip and looked at the arrangement. He had his compass in his hand, which he had picked up from the side table on instinct when he'd come in, and he held it now without using it, and he looked at the 12 bottles set out in their pattern, and the pattern was. He reached into his desk drawer and took out his magnifying lens without looking away from the bottles. He held it over them. He moved it slowly, adjusting distance. The 12 bottles were placed to form a map. It was not a map of anywhere Corvin had been. It was not a map of any territory he recognized from the hundreds of documents on the walls around him. It was a map of somewhere, clearly somewhere, with the internal logic of topography, the bottles indicating elevation by their size, the spacing between them indicating distance by a scale he could work out if he studied it, and the arrangement of them describing a coast, a river valley, a mountain range in the north, flat land to the south, but somewhere he had never been and never drawn. He stood very still with the magnifying lens over the 12 ink bottles and felt the hair on the back of his neck do something it had not done in 11 years. "Where is this?" he asked. Pip looked at him, the copper eyes were steady, warm, waiting. "This is a real place," Corvin said, "not a question." Pip made the chirprumble sound. Then he reached out one small talon and touched the brown ink bottle that stood at the position Corvin had tentatively mapped as the high ground in the northeast corner of the territory, and held it there. "You've been there," Corvin said. The talon rested on the bottle. "You came from there." The copper eyes did not look away. The internal amber pulse, always present, ran through Pip's chest twice in rapid succession and then settled back to its usual rhythm, and Corvin had no rational framework for interpreting the physiology of a dragon's emotional state, but something in the quality of that double pulse felt unmistakably like yes. Straightened up, he looked at the bottles, all 12 of them, this map of a place he didn't know made of his own inks by a creature that had evidently crossed considerable distance to arrive beneath his wheelbarrow on a drought-dry Tuesday morning. He thought about the crumpled wings. He thought about the faint wear marks on the leading edge of the primary wing struts that he had noticed when Pip was grooming, the kind of marks that suggested extended use, long travel, the sustained effort of getting somewhere. He thought about how the dragon had pressed its snout into his palm outside in the early morning light, and held there with the patience of a creature that had made a decision and arrived at its conclusion. He put his compass down on the table very carefully, the way he put instruments down when he was thinking about something that required all of him. "How long?" he said. "The 6th day was the day the candles ran out." This was not strictly accurate. It was the day Corvin discovered that his entire winter candle supply, 32 tapers stored in the cool dark of the pantry where they kept their shape, was gone. He had gone in for a jar of preserved pears from last autumn and found the shelf bare and the faint, sweet smell of melted beeswax hanging in the air like a confession. There was a small round scorch mark on the shelf where the most recent consumption had apparently occurred, and a scatter of wax flakes that formed, if you looked at them charitably, a very rough impression of a coastline. Corvin stood in the pantry for a moment with the preserved pears in his hand. He did not shout, he did not deliver a lecture. He was beginning to understand that lecturing Pip about things Pip had already done was an exercise in retrospective energy that produced nothing except his own mild elevation in blood pressure. What Pip had done was done, usually with internal logic, and what remained was to understand the logic, and where possible, reroute it toward less materially impactful channels. He came out of the pantry. Pip was on the kitchen table, which had become his primary indoor position, occupying the back left corner with the satisfaction of a creature that had established a territory and was at peace with it. He was glowing, not dramatically, not visibly from more than a few feet away. But in the dim kitchen, with the overcast sky outside blocking the usual morning light, the amber pulse in his chest was distinctly visible, and there was a general warmth radiating from his scales that had not been there a week ago. The candles. He had eaten the candles and was now, in a metabolic sense, being the candles. Corvin set the preserved pears down and looked at his living light source. The warm glow moved with Pip's breathing, expanding fractionally on the inhale, contracting slightly on the exhale, constant, and even and the exact amber gold of good beeswax at full burn. Soot, who had been losing ground in his campaign of principled resistance for approximately 5 days now, chose this moment to complete his surrender. He walked from his counter position to Pip's table corner, sat down 6 inches from the dragon, and began to wash his face with the particular vigor of a cat who has done nothing at all that requires comment, and is simply engaged in his own business. The warmth from Pip reached him clearly, his ears relaxed, his eyes half closed, his whole large gray body settling into the comfort of it with the boneless ease of a cat in sun. Pip looked at the cat. The cat did not look at Pip. Pip made a small sound, not the chirp-rumble, something newer and quieter, something Corvin hadn't heard before, a single low note that seemed to come less from the throat and more from some deeper location. And the amber glow in his chest pulsed once warmly, and then settled into something slightly brighter and slightly steadier than before. Corvin watched the two of them. He thought about 40 years of quiet. He thought about it the way you think about a place you have lived, with familiarity and knowledge and a genuine appreciation for its qualities. But from a distance, from the outside of it, the way you think about somewhere you have left. He hadn't left yet. He was still here in his kitchen in his cottage with his maps and his tools and his routine. Everything was materially the same. And yet something had changed in the quality of the air, the specific texture of the days, the way mornings felt when he came downstairs now. The cottage that had been quiet was now quiet in a different way, not empty quiet but occupied quiet. The quiet of a place where things were happening even in their stillness, where the stillness itself was purposeful rather than merely present. He had not expected to miss it when it arrived. The 6th evening was clear, which was unusual for the drought, which had been holding the sky in a flat white haze that drained the color out of the days and made the sunsets uncharacteristically bland. But on the 6th evening, something in the upper atmosphere shifted and the haze cleared and the sky went through its full range. The rose gold of the hour before dark, the deepening blue of the hour after, and then the true dark, the absolute, unpolluted dark of a village at the edge of a forest 30 miles from the nearest city, with every star available and accounted for. Corvin had gone to bed at his usual time. He had lain in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the cottage settling, and had gotten up again without deciding to, his body simply finding itself upright, dressed again, going downstairs, because there was something he wanted to do, and it was apparently going to happen now regardless of what his schedule said about it. He climbed back onto the roofs. Pip was already there. He was not on the ridge this time. He was on the south slope, which had the widest view of the sky, lying flat on the tiles with his wings spread to full extension. Wide, much wider than a week ago, the crumple almost entirely resolved, the membranes taut and smooth and the branching structure of the wing bones casting thin shadows in the starlight. He was looking up. His neck was extended, his head tilted back, and the copper eyes were fully open and fully lit, and moving across the sky with a methodical, consuming attention that made him look, in the star-scattered dark, like something very ancient that had been doing this for longer than Corvin had been drawing maps. Corvin sat down beside him. He drew his knees up and looked at the sky. The Meyerwing constellation was rising in the east. He found it the way you find old things, not by searching but by recognizing, the way a familiar face appears in a crowd before you've consciously looked for it. The 7 stars of the Navigator's Cluster, the formation he had used in the Mirroring Swamps in November 20 years ago, the stars that had given the swamp its name because the generations before him had looked up through the swamp fog and found the same 7 points and found their way home. He hadn't looked at those stars in 11 years. Pip moved beside him. Very slowly, with the deliberate care of something making a considered gesture, he extended one foreleg, one small talon, and traced the shape of the mirroring in the air above him, the exact shape, the correct angles, the precise relative distances between the stars. All 7 points touched in the navigational sequence, the order a sailor or a swamp-crossing cartographer would use them. Corvin's chest did the thing it had been doing all week, the thing that didn't have a good name. "You know what that is," he said. The copper eyes came around to him, and they were warm, and they were old, and they were patient, and he was certain of this. He was as certain of this as he had ever been of anything he'd put on paper, glad. Simply, deeply, uncomplicated glad. Pip turned back to the stars and traced the constellation again. Slower this time, teaching the pace of it, showing him that there was no hurry, that the stars would be there, that the way home, whatever way home was written up there in a language that neither of them had forgotten. And Corvin Dast, who had not seen trouble in 40 years, who had built his whole life around the principle that stillness was safety and routine was wisdom, and the past was best left where it lay, sat on his roof in the extraordinary dark of a drought-cleared night and felt the old interest move through him like weather, like the specific weather that comes before rain, when the air changes before a single drop has fallen and something in your body knows before your mind does. That everything is about to be different. The quiet life was still here. It was just no longer the only thing. She arrived on the 7th day in the late morning when the drought had finally broken. The rain had come in the night, not the tentative, apologetic rain of a long dry spell ending, but the full, committed, no-argument rain of a sky that had been holding something back for weeks and had finally run out of patience with itself. Corvin had woken to the sound of it on the roof tiles above his head, that particular percussion of genuine rain, and had lain in the dark listening to it with the specific pleasure of a man who has a sound roof and a dry bed and knows the value of both. The rain barrel would be full by morning, the turnips would recover, the creek would find its voice again. He had fallen back asleep to the sound of it, which was the best sleep he'd had in a week, and had not thought to wonder whether the dragon on the roof was getting wet until he was already halfway back under. Pip had not been on the roof when the rain started. Pip had, it turned out, relocated to the kitchen table and was dry and faintly steaming when Corvin came downstairs, giving off a warm vapor that smelled of rain on hot stone and something underneath that was distinctly his own, the warm ink and beeswax smell that had infiltrated the cottage over the preceding week until Corvin no longer noticed it except in its absence when he stepped outside. The kitchen was warm. The amber glow was steady. Soot was pressed against Pip's side with the contentment of a large gray cat who had entirely abandoned his principles and was at peace with the decision. The rain continued through the morning. Corvin worked. Pip moved around the cottage in his investigative way, pausing at each window to watch the rain with an attention that suggested he found it as interesting as everything else, possibly more, the way the drops moved down the glass, the patterns they formed, the sound texture of it against different surfaces. He spent a long time at the study window with one talon touching the glass, following individual drops in their descent with a concentration that Corvin, watching from the corner of his eye, found somehow moving. Then mid-morning there was a knock at the gate. Not at the door, at the gate, which was the knock of someone who understood property and was observing its boundaries, which immediately distinguished this visitor from everyone else who had come that week. Corvin went to the window and looked out through the rain and saw a woman standing at the gate with a dark traveling cloak that had the specific soaked quality of someone who had been walking in the rain for some time and had made a philosophical decision about it. She was not young and not old, somewhere in the difficult-to-read middle age that some people occupied for decades. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder, large and worn and clearly heavy, and she was looking at the cottage with eyes that were, even at this distance and through this rain, unmistakably precise. The eyes of someone who had come for a specific reason and intended to accomplish it. She saw Corvin in the window. She did not wave. She simply waited, which was the behavior of a person who had learned that patience was more effective than performance. Corvin went to the gates. "Corvin Dast," she said, not a question. "Oh, yes." Scholar Inez Falrit. She reached into her cloak and produced a card which she held out across the gate. The card was damp but readable, the gilded archive crest in the corner, her name and title, and a postal direction in the capital. "I've been traveling for 4 days. I would appreciate being let in." Corvin looked at the card. He looked at her. He looked at the satchel, which was the kind of satchel that contained books and papers and not weapons, and which had been subjected to enough use to have developed a character of its own. He looked at her eyes, which were the eyes of someone who was accustomed to libraries and the particular honesty that libraries produced in people. He opened the gates. She moved through the cottage with the quiet efficiency of a scholar accustomed to navigating other people's spaces, not touching anything she hadn't been invited to touch, not examining anything overtly, but seeing everything with the peripheral thoroughness of someone who had spent a career in archives learning to absorb information without appearing to absorb it. She clocked the maps in the hallway, the tools on the worktable visible through the study door, the specific arrangement of the room beyond that. She paused at the study door for just a moment, long enough for Corvin to see her register the spiral and understand it. And then she followed him into the kitchen without comment and sat at the table and put her satchel down beside her feet with the careful placement of someone who cared about the contents. Pip was on the table. Inez looked at him, Pip looked at her. The copper eyes ran over her the way they ran over everything new, completely, without apparent judgment, the way a very thorough map takes in territory, and then something shifted in them. Something that Corvin had not seen before, a quality of recognition, faint and quickly settled, like a man hearing a word in a language he studied long ago and remembering more than he expected to. Inez looked at Pip for a long time. Then she set her jaw in the specific way of someone confirming a hypothesis they were not entirely prepared to have confirmed, and turned to Corvin. "May I?" She indicated the table beside Pip with a slight gesture of her hand. "He decides," Corvin said, which was something he had not said out loud before but which was simply accurate. Inez turned back to Pip. She placed her hand on the table, palm up, approximately the same gesture Corvin had made on the morning of the first day under the wheelbarrow, the approach gesture, the gesture that said, "I am not demanding anything." Pip looked at the hand. He looked at her face. He stepped forward 3 steps on the table, slow, considered steps, and pressed his nose to the center of her palm, a brief contact, firm and deliberate, and then stepped back and sat with his tail wrapped around his feet and his copper eyes attentive. Inez closed her hand, not gripping, just completing the gesture. She exhaled. "Right," she said quietly, "there you are." "You know what he is," Corvin said. "I know what he is." She unclasped the satchel and withdrew carefully a book. Not a printed book, a bound manuscript, old, the leather cover soft with age and handling, the pages thick and handmade, the kind of book that had been made by someone and not a press. She set it on the table with the reverence that scholars reserved for things that were old and irreplaceable, and opened it to a page marked with a strip of darker leather. "Sit down, please." Corvin said. She turned the book so he could read it, but he found his eyes going to the illustration first before the text. It was a drawing, fine-lined, detailed, the work of someone who had been trained in technical illustration and had applied that training to the task with obvious care. It showed a dragon. Small, the drawing indicated by the scale figure beside it, no larger than a large cat. The scales were cross-hatched to indicate their iridescent quality. The wings were spread to their full extension. The eyes were drawn with the specific technique of someone trying to render something luminous in a medium that didn't naturally contain light. Concentric circles of hatching that somehow, through the sheer precision of their execution, managed to suggest depth. The caption below the illustration read, in the formal archival hand of the document's era, Cartographicum Draco Minor bonded state. Wing extension at 3rd week post-bonding. Corvin looked at the illustration for a long time. "3rd week," he said. "You found him 7 days ago," Inez said. "The wing extension suggests the bonding process began approximately when you picked him up, which is consistent with the records. Sometimes earlier, there are accounts of the bonding beginning at first eye contact, but physical contact is typically the catalyst." She turned the page. More illustration, the same dragon rendered from multiple angles with notations. They were called cartographicum by the scholars who documented them. Your people, your region, called them cartographers' dragons, which is less formal but more honest about what they actually are. "Bonded to mapmakers. To people who organize the world's information for a living," she corrected, and the correction was gentle but precise in the way of someone who had spent years being precise. "Surveyors, astronomers, archivists, navigation scholars. The earliest records connect them to the seafaring cultures of the Velmir coast, your coastal charts. I noticed several in your hallway, but they appear throughout the historical record wherever you find people who devoted their lives to knowing where things were. Not just geographically, the category is broader than that." "What's the category?" She considered people who needed to know the shape of the world in order to operate in it, people for whom the gap between what was mapped and what was unmapped was not an abstraction but a practical problem, people who could not stop themselves from wanting to fill in the blank spaces. She looked at him directly. People who went to places other people hadn't been and came back and wrote down what they'd found so that others could follow. The rain moved against the windows. Corvin's tea had gone cold, he had not noticed. "And the gift," he said, "you mentioned a gift." "They remember everything." She said it simply, without drama, which made it land harder than it would have with drama. Everything they encounter from the moment of bonding is recorded, perfectly, not approximately, perfectly. Every map they see, every document, every landscape they fly over, every conversation they hear. The early records suggest the capacity is essentially unlimited, though we have no way to verify that since no bonded pair ever reported finding a limit. She paused. Your maps in the study, the arrangement. He sorted them the first night. He read them, she said, all of them, he has them, all of them as perfectly as they were drawn, every annotation, every correction, every error. If every physical map you own were destroyed tomorrow, he could reproduce each one from memory with accuracy sufficient for field use. She let that settle. He remembered the ink bottles on the 5th day, the map he made. Did you recognize the territory? No. I might. She reached into the satchel again and produced a smaller document, a loose sheet, and laid it beside the manuscript. It was a sketch map, recent, the ink still fresh-looking, of a coastline and a river valley and a mountain range. This matches a report that came to the archive 6 weeks ago from a surveyor in the Eastern Territories, unmapped country north of the Thornback Range. She got as far as the river valley before her team ran out of provisions and had to turn back. She described the high ground in the northeast as particularly significant, possible pass-through to the far side of the range. Corvin looked at the sketch map. He looked at the arrangement of ink bottles still on the worktable in the study, visible through the door. The brown bottle the one Pip had touched had held his talon against, high ground northeast corner. He came from beyond the Thornback, Corvin said. From somewhere beyond it, Inez said. How far beyond, I can't tell you. What he encountered on the way, I can't tell you. What he was looking for, she stopped. She looked at Pip, who was sitting on the table with perfect stillness, the amber glow cycling through its slow, steady rhythm, the copper eyes moving between them as they spoke with the attention of someone following a conversation in a language they were acquiring in real time. What they were always looking for, she amended, was a cartographer. Someone whose mind worked in a way that was compatible with what they could offer. The bonding is not random. The records are consistent on this point. They do not bond with everyone they encounter. They search. The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Surgeon. Corvin thought about the impression in the soil under the wheelbarrow. The arrangement that suggested hours, possibly overnight. He thought about crumpled wings and the distance they implied, the distance that produced the wear marks on the leading edge of the primary struts that he had noticed during grooming. He thought about a small, luminescent creature crossing unmapped territory, crossing the Thornback Range, the range he had spent a season of his life mapping 20 years ago, before the knee, before Ashvin, before the decision to stop, flying on wings not yet fully formed through country that nobody had charted, looking for something specific. Looking for him. He thought about the roof. He thought about the stars. He thought about the Meyerwing constellation and the slow, deliberate way Pip had traced it in the air above them, each star touched in the navigational sequence, not showing off but teaching. Saying, I know this, I know you know this, let's know it together. He picked up his cold tea and looked at the wall and did not drink it. What happens if I say no, he said. Inez looked at him steadily. She had the quality of a person who had anticipated the question. You're 61 years old, she said, not unkindly. You have a bad knee, you haven't surveyed actively in 11 years. She looked at the study doorway. You still have all the tools, you still maintain them. The dividers are worn smooth from use, not from sitting in a drawer. The magnifying arm has been recently adjusted. I noticed the screw setting when I passed. She brought her eyes back to him. You're still a cartographer, you just stopped going anywhere. He did not argue with this. There was no honest argument to make. If you say no, she continued, Pip stays most likely. Bonded pairs don't separate once the bond is established. There are accounts of attempts and they are not pleasant reading for anyone involved. He lives here, he remembers your maps. He investigates your belongings. You turn people away from the gate, the turnips grow. She paused. And the blank spaces north of the Thornback Range stay blank. The rain made its sound against the windows. The fire in the hearth, Corvin had built a fire this morning for the first time since spring. The rain, having brought a cold with it, moved in the grate. The archive has resources, she said, and her voice shifted slightly, becoming the voice she used when she was being careful about the size of the thing she was describing so that it didn't frighten by its scale. Equipment, provisions. I have a letter from the director authorizing support for an expedition into the Eastern Territories, contingent on the participation of an experienced surveyor. The surveyor I originally approached declined on grounds of age. The next on the list declined for personal reasons. The third, she stopped. The third told me to come here. Who's the third? Emmett Varsh. Corvin was quiet for a moment. Emmett Varsh had been his surveying partner for 9 years long ago. He had been the man holding the other end of the measuring chain in the Thornback survey. He had been in the cave in the Sundrift Highlands during the historic storm. He had retired before Corvin, moved to a village on the coast, and they had corresponded intermittently for a while and then less and then not at all, in the way that friendships sometimes wound down not from any failure, but from the mutual, unspoken understanding that the chapter they had shared was complete, and neither of them had found a way to begin the next one. He said to come here, Corvin said. He said, and I'm quoting directly, if there's a cartographicum dragon in the world, it found Corvin Dast. It was always going to find Corvin Dast. Go tell him that and get out of the way. She allowed a small, contained smile. He seemed quite confident. Corvin looked at Pip. Pip was looking back at him. The copper eyes were doing the thing they did, holding more than eyes should be able to hold, containing not just attention but something patient and warm and unhurried, the look of a creature for whom time was not the same pressure it was for a 61-year-old man with a complicated knee and 11 years of accumulated stillness to account for. The look that said, I found you, I crossed the unmapped country and found you. The rest is yours to decide. Corvin thought about what it meant to have made maps for 30 years. Not the physical labor of it, the aching feet and the cold surveys and the days when the instrument wouldn't true and the nights when the weather came in before the work was finished. Not those things, those were just the body of the work, the exterior of it. He thought about what it had felt like to stand at the edge of a territory he had never walked and look at the blank space where the map stopped and understand that what lay beyond it was not emptiness but unknown fullness. That the blank space was not nothing, it was everything waiting. He had spent 11 years not standing at that edge. He had spent 11 years at the center of a very well-mapped territory, doing work he valued and did well, and he had told himself that this was wisdom and he had believed it, and it had been, in its way, true. But he stood up. He walked to the study doorway and looked at the spiral of maps on the walls, the history of the world being understood by the people who had tried to draw it, laid out in the arrangement that an 8-pound dragon had assembled in a single night because the arrangement was obviously correct and had been waiting for someone to see it. He looked at his own work in the spiral, placed in its proper conversation with everything that had come before and after it. He looked at the sketch map that Inez had laid on the table, the river valley, the unmapped coast, the high ground in the northeast. The possible pass. Nobody had been through it. Nobody had come back with numbers, with measurements, with the precise and honest record of what was actually there, the thing that turned possible into known. The blank space sitting north of the Thornback Range, accumulating its unknownness, waiting. He walked to the shelf. He took down his best compass. It was brass old, the surface worn to the specific dull gold of metal that had been handled by the same hands for decades. The needle moved in its housing with the frictionless, immediate responsiveness of a well-made instrument, swinging north and holding there with the certainty of something that knew where it was pointing and had never had reason to doubt it. He turned it over in his hand. The weight of it was exactly familiar. I'll need new boots, he said. He said it to the compass, more or less, though Inez and Pip were the ones who heard it. The quality of the silence in the kitchen changed. Inez left at mid-afternoon, when the rain eased to the kind of steady light rain that would last for days and fill everything. She had things to arrange, she said, the archive's resources to mobilize, the expedition timeline to confirm, the equipment list to begin. She would send a formal letter within the week. She shook Corvin's hand at the gate with the firm, no-nonsense grip of a woman who did not engage in hollow ceremony, pulled her damp cloak back up, and walked up the road toward the village without looking back, which was the behavior of someone who had done what they came to do and did not require further acknowledgement of it. Corvin stood at the gate for a moment after she'd gone. The road was wet and dark, the ruts filling slowly with clean water, and the elder oaks along the north were already responding to the rain in the way trees did, the leaves that remained on them brightening slightly as the dust of drought washed off. The air smelled the way air smelled when the world was recovering, green and cold and deep, the smell of soil receiving water it had been waiting for, everything underneath shifting back toward itself. He had been in Ashfin for 11 years. He had come here specifically. He had chosen this village and this cottage and this edge of the forest with the full intention of stopping. He had needed to stop, not for the knee, though the knee had been a convenient excuse to offer people who would have asked why, but for something more internal, something harder to describe. He had needed to stop because the years before stopping had been years of such relentless forward motion, such constant encounter with the world's edges and blank spaces, that he had begun to lose the thing that the motion was supposed to be in service of, the reason for it, the meaning underneath. He had needed to be still long enough to find out if there was still something in him that wanted to move, or whether the moving had been all there was. He had found out there was still something. He'd known it for years if he was honest. The tools maintained but unused. The maps studied in their spiral but not added to. The morning walks to the tree line, stopping at the point where the managed forest became the actual forest, looking into the deeper green without going in. He had known, he had simply been waiting for something to make the knowing actionable. He went back inside. The cottage was warm, the fire was low but steady. Pip was on the kitchen table, always the kitchen table, and was doing something that Corvin paused to watch. He had found Corvin's old survey journal, the one from the Thornback expedition, which had been on the shelf in the study and had apparently been of sufficient interest to relocate. He was turning the pages with his forefeet carefully, the talons pressing the corners back with the practice of something that had turned many pages. He was not just looking at the pages. He was reading them in whatever way a dragon read, his eyes moving with the systematic left-to-right regularity of reading rather than the random attention of browsing. Pausing at the sketches Corvin had made in the field, pausing longer at the measurements and the calculations in the margins. He was reading the record of the Thornback survey. 20 years of elapsed time and 312 miles of mapped territory, compressed into the field notes of a younger Corvin who had not yet known that he would eventually stop. Pip turned a page and found a sketch. Corvin remembered drawing it, the high pass at the range's northeastern limit, the one that looked northeast toward country nobody had reached yet, the sketch made at the end of a long day with numb fingers and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been climbing for 12 hours. He had drawn it in 2 minutes, a rough record of what he'd seen from that height, the line of the country falling away beyond the pass, suggesting the valley that the archive's recent report had confirmed was actually there. Pip touched the sketch with one talon. He looked up at Corvin's. The copper eyes said something that did not require a common language to receive. They said, "This is where I came from, this is the direction I crossed. You were looking at the place I would come from 20 years before I came, and neither of us knew it, and here we both are." Corvin pulled out his chair and sat down across the table from the dragon. "Show me," he said, "show me what you remember of it." Pip set the journal down carefully and spread both forefeet flat on the table surface. Then slowly, he began to press the tips of his talons into the polished wood, not deep enough to mark it, but present, just present, with a precision that Corvin recognized immediately as spatial precision, the precision of someone indicating not just position but relationship between positions. He was drawing a map. With 8 talons and the surface of a kitchen table, he was drawing a map of country he had flown over, country nobody had charted, country that existed north of the pass in Corvin's 20-year-old sketch. The map was extraordinary. It took 11 minutes. Corvin did not move during those 11 minutes except to lean forward, elbows on the table, to see better. The talons moved with the confidence of something working from a perfect record, not estimating but transcribing, each position of each tip representing something real and verifiable. A peak, a river bend, a coastal feature. The internal logic of topography translated into the language of an indicated point and the space between indicated points. When Pip finished, he sat back and looked at Corvin with an expression that was, by now familiar, the patient, warm, well expression. Corvin looked at the table. Then he stood up, went to the study, came back with a sheet of blank cartography paper and his ruling pens and his compass, and sat back down. Again, he said slowly. They worked until the light failed. Corvin drew and Pip indicated, talon tip to table. Corvin translating the indicated points into measurements and recording them with the ruling pen and the compass, the way he had worked 30 years ago with a partner holding the other end of the chain. Both of them translating the physical world into numbers that could be carried out of the field and turned into something other people could use. The work had a rhythm that came back to him faster than he expected, faster than his body had expected, his hands remembering sequences they had not performed in 11 years, and performing them with the residual precision of muscle memory, the compass and pen moving with a sureness that came from somewhere deeper than recent practice. The map grew, the northeast coast, the river valley, the high ground, the pass confirmed by Pip's indication, the exact pass with a measurement of its approximate elevation that matched what the archive surveyor had estimated from the valley floor. Beyond the pass, detail that nobody had, a second river, a plateau. What appeared to be at the northern edge of what Pip had covered in his flight, the edge of a much larger geographical feature. Something Corvin, looking at the proportions and the directional indicators, thought might be the beginning of an enormous inland lake, possibly the largest body of fresh water in the Eastern Territories. A feature that would, if it existed at scale, rewrite the hydrographic understanding of the entire region. He set the pen down when the kitchen was too dark to see by and lit a lamp, not a candle, he had no candles. He looked briefly for a candle before remembering and caught Pip's expression of innocent absence of guilt and held the lamp over the finished sheet. He looked at it for a long time. It was not a finished map. It was a field sheet, a working document, the kind of rough record that was the beginning of a map rather than the map itself. It would need verification. It would need ground survey, elevation measurements taken at the source, the river distances walked and timed, the coastal features examined from a closer vantage than Pip's aerial perspective could provide. There was work in this sheet for a full season, possibly two. But the shape was there. The shape of country that had not had a shape before, that had been blank space with a line of mountains guarding it, that was now beginning to be known. He thought about the blank spaces in the old maps on the walls of his study, the ones that had been blank because the world was larger than the people who tried to draw it, and some of it kept exceeding their reach. He thought about the tradition of cartographers who had spent their lives reducing the blank, pushing the known a little further, accepting that they would not finish and going anyway. He thought about Emmett Varsh holding the other end of the chain in the northeast Thornback Pass, 20 years ago, looking at the same country from the same high ground. Both of them understanding that the country beyond it was there, but neither of them, that time, going further. Not that time. He folded the field sheet carefully, the bone folder making its clean crease. He put it in the map case that had lived on the study shelf for 11 years. He carried the case to the hook by the door, the hook that had always been for traveling things, and hung it there. Soot watched this from his windowsill with the expression of a cat reviewing a situation, and finding it consistent with predictions he had been making since Tuesday. Pip was on the back of Corvin's chair with his wings held at their new full extension, the lamplight coming through the translucent membranes and making them glow like windows. He was looking at the map case on the hook. Then he looked at Corvin. The copper eyes were steady and warm and old and patient and glad. They had been glad since Tuesday morning, since the wheelbarrow and the scorched boot and the small, embarrassed sneeze, since the forearm grip and the purr that operated at the frequency of something that had found what it was looking for. They had been glad through the weeks and the chaos and the investigations and the ink and the candles and the stars on the clear night above the drought-pale village. They had been glad in the particular way of something that has made a long journey and arrived and needed nothing to happen next, except what was already happening. Corvin stood in his kitchen on the 7th night with the rain outside and the fire inside and the map case on the hook, and looked at the dragon on the back of his chair. "We'll need to be careful with the knee on the ascent," he said. "The northeast pass has a bad section, roughly the last quarter mile. Scree slope can't be avoided. I'll need to go slowly." Pip made the sound. The chirp rumble, the small warm thunderstorm, the sound that lived in the space between languages and contained all of them. Corvin sat down in his chair, carefully with the knee the way he always sat down now, and opened the survey journal to the page with the Thornback sketch and looked at it again. His handwriting from 20 years ago was slightly different from his handwriting now, more urgent, less controlled. The hand of someone who was always writing in a hurry because there was always more to record than time allowed. He thought he might write in that hand again. He put the journal down and looked at the fire and listened to the rain and felt the warmth radiating from the creature on the back of his chair, the steady amber pulse of it, the deep constant warmth of something that had not found a reason to stop glowing since the morning it had pressed its warm jaw against his wrist under the apple trees, and decided in whatever way such decisions were made that this was the person, this was the place, this was the beginning of the work. Outside, the creek that had not been a creek was a creek again. The turnips would recover. The elder oaks were standing in the rain with their arms out, accepting what had been withheld. The village of Ashvin was sleeping in its ordinary, unbothered way, 37 years of no interesting news accumulating into 38. Not knowing that at the edge of the forest in the old cartographer's cottage, a kettle was being replaced on its proper hook, and a compass was on the shelf, and a map case was on the hook by the door, and everything was, on the surface, exactly as it had been. Except that it wasn't. Except that the quality of the stillness had changed, the same way it had changed in the first 7 days, only more so, changed from the stillness of an ending to the stillness of a beginning, the specific held-breath stillness of a moment before motion, before the first step out, before the edge of the known territory gives way to the country that has not been drawn yet. The quiet life was over. Corvin Dast was 61 years old, with a bad knee and a good compass and 11 years of accumulated rest, and a creature on the back of his chair who held, in the perfect archive of its copper-eyed memory, the shape of the world that nobody had mapped yet. He was, beneath everything, beneath the practicality and the caution and the long habit of stillness, interested. Deeply, irrevocably, bone-deep interested. He blew out the lamp. The kitchen held the fire's glow and Pip's glow together, amber on amber, warm in the rainy dark, the two of them breathing in the same rhythm without having decided to, and outside the unknown country waited in its darkness with all the patience of places that have never been named, holding their shapes for whoever came with the instruments and the intention and the willingness to finally, at last, write it all down.